much, and thank you all very much for having me this evening. If I can just make a link to the previous presentations to start with, and then I'll talk more specifically about air pollution. There is no point thinking that we can offset indefinitely harmful emissions of any sort, because whether you plant trees, whether you plant palm trees or whatever else, trying to offset ever-growing harmful emissions is a completely hopeless strategy. The only sensible approach is actually we need to let people pass. The only sensible strategy is to reduce the need for energy and emissions and become more resource efficient. And then, of course, be very careful, as we've heard before, about where any of those resources come from. So that is the link to the previous bit. I'll try and be as quick as I can. Air pollution is much worse than most of us have realised. Everyone sort of thinks of the Great Smog of 1952, and we had a very big problem, over 4,000 extra coffins in a week, from short-term exposure to visible air pollution. And that problem was largely addressed. It's coming back in Wandsworth with the burning of wood in log fires and things. But people think that that problem was addressed. They make the mistake of thinking that problem was addressed by the Clean Air Act. But what's happened is that the known health effects of air pollution have risen much faster than air pollution has actually come down, or in fact changed, because it changed from really coal-fired emissions to, in particular in London, diesel exhaust. Diesel exhaust of all sorts. So while coal emissions have come down, actually diesel has shot up, and the known health effects, both in terms of adults, heart attacks and strokes, but also in terms of the impact on children, and we've seen quite a lot of that. Today, obviously, the link with the vulnerability, the impact of air pollution on those with heart attacks has been a news story today, starting from first thing this morning. If we just try and put some numbers on it, air pollution is roughly twice World Health Organization guideline levels and legal limits near most of London's busiest roads. And if we just look at what air pollution actually is, we're talking about two different things. We're basically talking about particles, dangerous airborne particles, and they're regulated as a sort of package, the mass, World Health Organization guidelines and legal limits for the sort of mass or the concentration of those particles in the atmosphere. We're also worried about the gases bit of air pollution. And of the gases, the only molecule, that's quite an achievement. The only bit of the entire gas component which is actually regulated is the nitrogen dioxide molecule. So imagine this whole sort of like cloud of gas, and then we just focus on the amount of the nitrogen dioxide molecule. So when the government and others try and say, we're not too worried about the health effects of nitrogen dioxide, not only are they wrong about that, but actually it's wrong to think of the gaseous component as just the nitrogen dioxide molecule. In terms of health effects, the government's own numbers, if you separate out exposure, in terms of human exposures, impacts, and then outcomes, of course air pollution never appears on a death certificate, but heart attacks and strokes do, is that the government's own numbers, when you look at these health impacts clearly, separate them out, is that air pollution, even just long-term exposure to fine particles, is the second biggest public health risk. Only smoking is bigger, so the government's numbers are about 80,000 a year dying from smoking, 30,000 just from long-term exposure to particles, and you can probably add another 20,000 to that at least. and about 20,000 from alcoholism, 10,000 from obesity, and guess what, 2,000 from road traffic accidents. So, broadly speaking, air pollution kills 10 times the number of people that die from road traffic accidents. Now, the government doesn't like putting this message out because somebody might say, well, what are you doing about it? So they really do try and keep this out of the public eye, and they're very, very naughty, surprise, surprise, and the previous government was the same. So, second biggest public health risk, only smoking is bigger. Living or going to school within 150 metres of the busiest roads could be responsible for 15 to 30% of all new cases of asthma in children. And a year ago, the World Health Organization classified diesel exhaust as carcinogenic for humans. So a class 1 carcinogen, same as smoking. The good news is that there are powerful legal limits in place which actually have to be complied with. Now, these are European laws. The government and the mayor have both actively been lobbying to weaken these laws. 2013 is actually the year of air. The European Commission has declared it the year of air, and the government and the mayor are both lobbying to have these laws weakened. They have been in place in legislation since 1999 to be complied with by 2010 for nitrogen dioxide, and 2011 for particles, which was a 6-year delay from the original deadline of 2005. And the government and the mayor both say we'd like flexibility, and we don't want to change these laws or anything, we just want flexibility to comply with them. And that can only mean one thing, which is weakening the current laws. They really don't like being pinned down on that. Now, the laws are important. Clean Air in London published a list of 60 schools near roads carrying over 100,000 vehicles a day and a half before the planning inspector heard the London plan session, which I gave evidence at. And as a result of that, I think, the mayor did tighten up his London plan, and it's one of the things which really he does particularly deserve to be congratulated on. That London plan, perhaps as a result of getting this shock of all the schools near busy roads, in fact we've now published a list of over 1,000 schools near these roads in London, and 2,500 schools within 450 metres of these roads. But the London plan does say that development should be at least air quality neutral and not lead to any deterioration of air quality in areas where an air quality management area has been declared, which is, I think, now it's the whole of the Wandsworth Borough. And also, there are provisions in the London plan which say that you are not allowed, or you shouldn't, dump more pollution on vulnerable people, which can be older people or children, and you shouldn't dump vulnerable people in the most polluted parts. So there are some very strong provisions in the London plan. Also, importantly, and I think this is if you're looking at campaigning here, it's not just about more sources of combustion in London, which is the last thing we need with legal limits being breached by a country mile. We certainly don't want big new diesel generators in London or incinerators, but it's also about a whole lot of traffic to do with big developments, and that is also a serious issue. There are two particular powers in EU law. The Air Quality Directive 2008/50/EC, which I spent the first 3 years of this 7-year campaign working on or lobbying for. But there are two particular provisions in that. The first is that limit values, which are the sort of legal standard to be complied with, are basically a lockstep. So that once you actually find anywhere in Wandsworth which is below this limit value for particles or the gases, once it's below, they are absolutely not, even if the weather is bad and makes it difficult for them, they are not allowed to approve something which makes that, takes you through that lockstep level. And I've used that, Clean Air in London's used that to play a serious part in stopping the third runway at Heathrow. And on that, the previous government basically said they gave the Environment Agency powers where they could basically have wheel-clamped aeroplanes if those limits were going to be breached. Also with the Olympics, ensured that they did not make those limits or breach those limits, and with the Western Extension. Now, what's important is that you just need to find anywhere which is below this limit which could go above it, and that's, I think, one of the issues which happened at Southall and elsewhere. The other thing you're not allowed to do, it'd be completely illogical if you're above one of these limits, obviously, to make things worse. So I would suggest that you have a look at the London Plan, have a look at the directive. What they are allowed to do is mitigate, to offset an increase. So if they basically, I mean, what they could do, they could say that we're going to put in a whole lot of diesel generators in the Battersea development, but we're going to have a low emission zone around it and ban all diesel cars. So they could do something like that. Yeah, it's not very sensible, because guess what? They ought to be doing both. Not having diesel generators and not having diesel cars. Just a couple of final points, just to point you to some resources. On the Clean Air London website, here, if you just float over public, this is the, so it's cleanairlondon.org. The Twitter username is Clean Air London, because you haven't got enough letters for in. But this is the campaign website. There are a couple of things here. One is a diesel exhaust map and how polluted is my road. Basically, that is Clean Air London published a list of the most polluted roads in London a couple of weeks ago, and the Green Party have actually mapped those 40,000 road links over the last couple of weeks, and it's on a Guardian website. So if you just click on that for 1 second.
Yeah. This is what we've got.
Yeah, that's that. So this is basically, you can do this. Yeah. And their website is called, they've now got a website of their own, I think it's called howpollutedismyroad.org.uk, and you can see for 40,000 road links in London exactly which ones are the most polluted. So you can look around here and you can see, this is, don't forget, these are emissions, these are not concentrations, which is what we breathe, this is what comes out of tailpipes, this is just exhaust emissions, but it will give you a sense of where the real problems will be.
It's based on the number of cars travelling rather than any measure of actual pollution.
Well, this is based on the Mayor's computer modelling. So what he does is he estimates how many cars or trucks or TfL buses will be there. He then he uses his assumptions about what they'll each emit, and then he produces this great big database. So that's one thing. The second thing, if you go back to the campaign website, there's a quick guide to air pollution, top right, which basically talks about the year of air and so on. This, by the way, was the, we get back to it, the Mayor's pollution suppressor truck. He was using spraying glue in front of air quality monitoring stations, and he reduced the particles in front of the one on the Olympic route network by just under 40% last year. Clean Air London called it public health fraud on an industrial scale, because that's what it basically was. He's now agreed to stop doing that. If you go down to the bottom, or go back to the home page, and then down here, 10 steps for Clean Air in London. Basically, it's a sort of guide for campaigners in terms of the sort of things to look at. Finally, just to close off, this is the year of air, and I think there is a fabulous opportunity to look more widely at the energy we need to use, the transport we need to use, look more wisely at how we provide that energy, where it comes from, and certainly not from non-sustainable sources. Because if we can do that, really London and the rest of, London as the only megacity in Europe, can really show how we can tackle wider air pollution and sustainability issues to, the other big cities. So there's a great opportunity here. There's a sort of strong case, and I think it's a very coherent case that you've heard from the other speakers.